I think one of the ways people are reading this wrong is they're seeing this only as a Middle East war. And of course it is that. But it's also a Western Hemisphere energy story. And once you start looking at it like that, Trinidad and Tobago is not outside the frame at all. We're inside it. Because what this war is doing is not just creating destruction in the Middle East, it is also putting pressure on the global energy system. Reuters reported this week that Iran's disruption around the Strait of Hormuz pushed Gulf producers like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to look for ways to reroute exports, while Brent crude stayed above $103 a barrel after some limited relief from resumed Iraqi exports. So that is the first thing to understand. This is not just a war in the abstract. This is a war affecting supply. And once supply starts getting affected, Washington, obviously, and the world starts looking around and asking a very simple question. Where else can we get barrels from? And where can we get them in a way we can still shape and control? And that's where Venezuela matters. Not might matter, matters. Because if you look at what has happened just in the last couple of weeks, the United States and Venezuela's interim authorities have agreed to re-establish diplomatic and consular relations. Reuters also reported that the US flag has gone back up at the former embassy compound in Caracas, which is a very clear sign that this is not just talk anymore. So the shift is already happening, and it's not just diplomatic either. There are reports on March 18th that the US Treasury broadly authorized transactions involving PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, in a move aimed at stimulating investment, raising output, and helping stabilize energy markets around the wider Iran crisis. A few days before that, there was widened sanctions waivers covering more activity in Venezuela's energy and petrochemical sectors. So when people say, well, maybe Washington will move on from Venezuela if this war gets worse, I would actually put it differently. Washington is already moving. The question now is how far it goes. And that brings us back to Trinidad. Because in the Dragon conversation, the issue was already that Trinidad's gas future is tied up with what Washington allows and what happens in Venezuela. That was already true. But with this war, the whole thing becomes bigger than just Dragon by itself. Because now Venezuela, not only relevant as a sanctions case or a political problem, it is relevant as part of a supply answer. And once Venezuela becomes part of this supply answer, then the wider energy system around Venezuela starts to matter more too. Gas matters more. Infrastructure matters more. Processing capacity matters more. LNG matters more. And that is where Trinidad and Tobago starts becoming useful in a more serious way. Now, I want to be careful here because this is where small states can fool themselves. Useful is not the same as central. Trinidad is not the main thing Washington is focused on. Oil is still the main thing. That means Guyana becomes very important because it is politically easier and production is growing fast. Venezuela becomes important because the reserves are massive and can be partially reopened under US control. Trinidad is different. We matter because we sit in the gas and LNG layer of this whole regional energy space. So I would not say Trinidad is the center of the story. I would say Trinidad is part of the mechanism. And that still matters a lot, actually. Because if you're part of the mechanism, that can create room for you, but only if you understand what game you're in. And I think the best way to think about it is not moral language, not ideological language, but strategy. Really, what Trinidad is in here is a repeated game with the United States, not a one-off negotiation, not one license and done. This is an ongoing relationship where Washington has larger power, but Trinidad has specific value. And in a repeated game like that, the smartest move for the smaller player is usually not open resistance, and it is not total obedience either. It is bounded cooperation, meaning you work where interests overlap. You stay dependable, you make yourself useful, but you do not tie your whole future to assumptions that the bigger power will always keep the door open. That, to me, is the theory side of it. Very simple. So what follows from that in policy terms? First, Trinidad should be pushing for longer and more predictable US licensing horizons where Venezuelan gas is concerned. If Washington is reopening Venezuela in a controlled way, and all the signs say that it is, then Trinidad should not be operating on short rolling uncertainties all the time. That uncertainty kills planning, investment, and confidence. The fact that the US is restoring diplomatic ties and broadening energy permissions tells you there's already more flexibility in the system than before. Second, if the war keeps prices high and Trinidad gets some upside from that, then the government has to treat that as temporary money, not permanent money. That is basic, but it matters. If the price lift is coming from conflict and route disruption, then it can disappear the same way. So the smart move is buffers, reserves, debt reduction, foreign exchange support, not acting like a wartime spike is some new norm. Reuters reporting this week makes clear that the current price pressure is tied directly to disruption and rerouting phase around Hormuz. Right? So third, Trinidad should stop thinking about this only in national terms. This is a Southern Caribbean energy moment. Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, and the Venezuelan connection together now matter more in global calculations than they did even a few years ago. If we all operate separately, outside powers will handle us separately. If there is more coordination, even informally, then the region has more weight. Fourth, Trinidad has to be careful about dependency, because one of the things the latest moves show very clearly is that access to Venezuelan energy still runs through Washington. The US is reopening, yes, but it is reopening on its own terms. Diplomatic ties are back, the embassy is active again, PDVSA transactions are being authorized. But all of that proves not just flexibility, it proves who is setting the rules. So the opportunity is real, but so is the leverage. And that is why I think the real lesson here for Trinidad and Tobago is this. Don't read this war only through missiles and headlines, but read it through supply control and regional repositioning, because that is what is happening. The Middle East is under strain. The old routes are unstable. Washington is moving to secure alternatives. Venezuela is being brought back in, not freely, but selectively. And once that starts happening, Trinidad is affected, whether we talk about it or not. So the real question for us is not whether the war is far away. The real question is whether we understand quickly enough that it is already changing the energy politics of our own neighborhood, right?